That's when you need to cultivate relationships with the fabric companies to create samples for them or for a shop. And that way you can get your design out there in the latest and greatest fabrics.
Yeah, I feel like it's a catch-22. Which one do you want to do? Because you will get those quilters that reach out and be like, where is the fabric that is in this sample? That's what I want to make. I don't want anything different.
Welcome to Quilting on the Side, the podcast where we uncover the secrets to turning your passion for quilting into a profitable side hustle.
I'm Tori from the Quilt Patch by Tori.
And I'm Andi from True Blue Quilts. And together we're your co-hosts on this exciting journey of creativity, entrepreneurship, and all things quilting.
We're here to help you navigate the world of quilt pattern design, course creation, digital marketing, and running an online quilt business. We've been through the ups and downs ourselves, so we know what it takes to make money from your favorite hobby.
Our topic today is quilt pattern design and where the inspiration comes from. So I want to know, what is the first pattern that you offered for sale, and where did that pattern idea come from?
Oh my goodness, my very first pattern, it was Target the Stars. And I had been sketching for at least 2 years, just coming up with random designs. And I didn't like any of it. I was using pencil and and graph paper. And I made a few, I made a pumpkin quilt out of that, which was kind of fun because I just really wanted to make a pumpkin quilt. And I didn't find any pumpkins that I liked at that point. There's a lot more cute pumpkins now. But yeah, Target the Stars. I was sitting with my husband who was recovering from back surgery. And I started with a star in the center and then just kind of worked my way out, framing it in different ways. And then I figured out how to create that frame with half square triangles. So that was my very first pattern. And when I launched my website, that was my first and only pattern when I launched my website. So I had a funny story about that. So I made the design and then I wrote the pattern, and the pattern ended up being 36 pages. And I'm like, there's something wrong here. How did they get it so short? And I sent it to my first pattern tester ever, which was my mom's best friend. And she was like, Tori, this doesn't have to be 36 pages. And I'm like, I don't know, how do I fix this? She's like, use a table, put the measurements in a table. Because what I had done was taken the quilt and made it 3 sizes. And then each size I'd broken up into entire sections. And I didn't need to do that. So when I created that table, it ended up being, I think, 8 pages. Mm-hmm. It's a half square triangle. And I wanted large pictures and large fonts so that it's easy to read. But yeah, it ended up being about 8 pages by the time I was done. Much more detailed, way better layout, and a few color options and stuff. And that was really fun. It's still one of my favorite quilts that I have. And I hang it every fall because it has nice summer to fall colors in it.
That's great. So were you planning to sell the pattern when you sat down to design the quilt?
I did. It was when we were taking patchwork, which is that business class with Shannon Brinkley. My husband was recovering again from back surgery. We were watching a lot of Star Wars. That's why I started with the star, because we had a 2-year-old son and he liked the lightsabers. So we were watching a lot of Star Wars. And so that's why I started with the star. And I knew I wanted to create a series of patterns. And I liked the stars because that's kind of where I started. Yeah, with that one I was thinking, what pattern do I like? Because that's how I started the pumpkin quilt when I made that one. So I picked stars. Mm-hmm. And then if you've ever seen a trunk show from me, or if you've ever seen my Instagram, all of my patterns are stars. All of them are stars. Just lately, I've been shaking it up with some garden quilt inspiration. But yeah, my whole first series of patterns were all stars.
Very understandable, because when I got my website up and was starting to sell online, I followed a online sales teacher who recommended putting your work in collections. And my first collection was the Starburst collection because I had so many different patterns and quilts that had stars in them. So
why did you pick stars? Where'd that inspiration come from?
I like making those kind of blocks. They're interesting enough for experienced quilters, and yet they're simple enough for beginners. So it covers the whole range of quilting. And I'm trying to remember what my actual first pattern that I offered for sale. I think I made a snowball quilt, an I Spy for my daughter.
Oh.
And when she was about 3 years old, and I wrote the pattern for that. And I think that was the first one that I put up on Etsy before I had my own website. So yeah, mine was a little bit backwards because I made the quilt for my daughter, not necessarily as a pattern to sell, but it continues to be a good, solid, popular pattern.
That's cool. So my first question for you, Andi, is how do you start a project? Do you start first with fabric inspiration, or do you get inspiration for the design first?
I typically go for the design first. I find it very challenging to, like, the Facebook posts that you'll see in quilt groups, someone will lay out and they're like, okay, I have this 3-yard bundle, of 3 different colors, 1 yard each. What should I do with it? And I freeze. I can't think of anything. Although if I see a particular fabric that I fall in love with, I'm like, okay, I want to do something with that. And it's hard to define which is the chicken and which is the egg in that situation. But I typically will go for the design and then figure out the colors and shop for the specific fabrics rather than do the fabric first.
When you're making the design, do you tend to have colors that kind of pop up in your mind, or do you kind of wait to the end?
I wait till the end just because I design a lot with EQ8, and you make the block first and then you color it. So those are kind of the steps that you go through to work in that program. And so it's also very easy to try out a lot of different color combinations. So I like to do that too. I'll do my favorite monochromatic blue, and then I'll play with Christmas, I'll play with patriotic, I'll play with fall combinations and, pastels, just whatever, color story you want to tell. You can fit into any design, actually. So I don't limit myself really from that direction. But what about you? Do you start with fabric, or do you start with the design and the blocks?
Before I answer, I just want to say EQ8 stands for Electronic Quilter 8, version 8. In case anybody's confused on what Andi's talking about, it's Electronic Quilter version 8 and helps us design different quilts using, well, you can make your own blocks or you can use the traditional blocks. It's a really cool program. Sometimes it's been fabric first. Usually it is design first. And I usually work with not quite black and white. Usually it's like navy for some reason, navy blue, and then colors start coming to mind as I'm designing it. And then sometimes I stick with them and sometimes I don't. I like the quilt behind me. The one I've got on the wall right now is my Mirror pattern that's coming out later this year. And it's got a lot of triangles in it. And it's just 2 colors. I got a stark bright white and a dark green. And I kind of stuck with that. I wanted something really striking for this particular pattern because it makes the effect just greater with those 2 striking things. But with my Target the Stars that I was talking about earlier, I kind of had the same inspiration where I had 2 colors I was working with in EQ8 when I got it in there after the graph paper. And then I walked into my local quilt store and she had just unpacked a box full of grunge and stacked it on the cutting table. And I like gasped and I was like, those are the colors. Those have to go in my quilt. And they were a grunge, like, what do you call them? Like a muddy orange, a purple, and a turquoise. Now it sounds kind of off, but when you see it in the quilt, it looks amazing together. And she had it stacked exactly like that: orange, purple, and blue. If I remember right. Quilting on in front of me. And I was like, that's it. That's what I want. That's going on my quilt. And I stood there and I bought exactly what I needed and I got it home and I put it in the quilt and it was just amazing. But I had to see it like stacked up. Otherwise I was kind of frozen because I wanted to add more color than just two. And then when I saw that, I was like, yes, there it is. That's the color I need.
Yeah, that's a beautiful combination. Since I've had the pleasure of seeing that quilt in person, it's wonderful. Which leads me to another question related to fabric choices. You made that quilt all in grunge. Do you tend to stick with one collection, one line of fabric, or do you like roam the entire quilt store and pull from all the shelves?
I roam the entire quilt store. However, I will say that I tend to pick the lines because they go together. Like the same fabric lines. They tend, all the colors go together. And I tend to kind of pull the same line on accident. My local quilt store I should say, I don't have one here yet. The times are kind of off here. But the one that I went to religiously when we lived in Arizona, she had some lines put together, but mostly it was separated by color. So I'd go around and find the colors I want. And then a lot of times they were all the same line.
Yeah, I can do a lot of shopping just in, like, most quilt stores have a color wall. Yeah. And they may have different manufacturers, different designers that make those kind of foundation basic kind of lines, which is wonderful. So I can do a lot. I try not to pull from one line very often, just because I like more texture in my quilts. And if you have one line of fabric, even if you've got a lot of colors, they all have that same basic texture in whatever the print is. So like there's some, grunge has the splotchiness. There's some basics that have kind of a linen feel to them, or there's some that may have just tiny little stars or something on the quilt. And if every single fabric that you're putting together has that same little detail, I feel it reads a little flat. But that's my opinion, and everybody can do whatever they want with their quilts. I'm certainly not the quilt police, but I do like to explain my thinking when I pull those different colors and different prints together.
Oh, what was that quote from Tula Pink that Becca shared in one of our interviews? It was, "It's not perfect, but it's mine."
Mm-hmm.
I love that.
Yeah, that is a very freeing sentiment. I have learned over the years that other people's opinions don't matter quite as much as you think they do. Mm-hmm. So I don't have a problem just doing my own thing, but I kind of feel that people need to push those boundaries a little more sometimes. Oh, yeah. But of course, if you're comfortable with it, then do your own thing.
That's how we get new things in the quilting industry, is when you push the boundaries.
Yep.
I will say though, if you're a brand new pattern designer and you're trying to come up with fabric for a pattern sample, to stick with not solids, but those prints that read solid or less busy. That way your pattern can stand out. So having maybe one print, a focal point, especially if that's what you love. which is beautiful. And you can mix in some more basics to go with it. That way your pattern stands out. Because if you have too many pattern fabrics, you tend to lose the pattern in the quilt. So depending on the size of your blocks and things like that, if you're a brand new pattern designer, usually your pattern could stand out better if your fabric is more monochromatic or, not your entire fabric that you choose, but the individual fabric. So like if you have red stars and blue stars and purple stars all in the same fabric, it's really, really busy with all the different colors. And obviously stars, depending on the size, can be really busy. We were just talking about stars, so that's what came to mind. Versus if you get a blue, like a dark blue with a light blue polka dot, that's a lot more subtle. It has texture still, but it'll still allow your pattern to stand out, not necessarily the fabric to pop. That kind of difference. Or you can go straight solid or grunge like I did, which is, I use a lot of grunge. I really like that one. Just it's a little bit of texture.
Grunge is one of my favorite background kind of blender fabrics too. So I'm right with you on loving that line of fabric. And my tip corollary to what you were saying about trying to stay with some of those less busy prints is if you stick with some of those that are not the trendy, popular, busy print, obvious print, they will age better because fabric companies are always coming out with new lines of fabric, and you may use something and not be able to publish the pattern for it with the sample because it takes, it can take several months to get a sample done and a pattern ready for sale. And by then your sample is out of date and people have already bought that fabric and made projects with it. But if you really like to be on the cutting edge, that's when you need to cultivate relationships with the fabric companies to create samples for them or for a shop. And that way you can get your design out there in the latest and greatest fabrics.
Yeah, I feel like it's a catch-22. Which one do you want to do? Because you will get those quilters that reach out and be like, where is the fabric that is in this sample? That's what I want to make. I don't want anything different. And then you also want to be in fashion. I mean, with a lack of a better term there, on the cutting edge, like you said. So that way you can sell patterns now.
We know that color trends change. I grew up in the 80s and 90s when dusty rose was the the hot color, and we all know the harvest gold from the 70s. There's certain colors that just fit with one era, and you're like, oh, that, if you start using that too soon, it's dated, and you have to wait just a few more years to get into the vintage look.
I guess that's true.
Oh gosh. So thinking about those things, how much does not necessarily the color schemes and the fashion industry of whatever color is trendy, but your future customer, how much do they play a part in your quilt design? Are you designing for the more expert level, the more beginner level? How do you make that determination?
I make quilts that I would like to make as a quilter, whether I am a little more advanced and just want a quick project, or if I'm a beginner and want something just slightly challenging. I don't tend to have too simple projects, but I do use a lot with half square triangles. So they tend to be pretty easy if you can master the half square triangle. And then on the flip side, I also have like foundation paper piecing patterns that are like really complicated. I have my spangled stars, which has both. The middle is super simple with half square triangles and squares. And then the border is all paper pieced. So you can have the quilt in the center. If you don't want to touch paper piecing, it's still a beautiful quilt. Or you can get fancy and add the paper piecing border all the way around.
Yep. And there
so
we
really,
go.
I just kind of stick with what I like. And it's something that might last in my mind for a while. But yeah, what about you? How does it play a part in your future designs and inspiration?
I guess I would err on the side of marketing to less experienced quilters, keeping my designs more on that simple side, that you can always step up depending on your skill level and with the quilting, because I've seen, very, very beautiful heirloom quality quilts that are with very simple construction. So that's not to say that, simple is just for beginners, because any level of quilter
Not at all.
can make it beautiful. It doesn't have to be, the Judy Niemeyer 10,000 pieces 10-year project to be a beautiful quilt. But I just think that as you gain more experience with quilting, you depend less on the pattern.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, because
it's more of a guide.
You can figure out a lot of it on your own. And so just kind of a natural evolution of quilting, a beginner is going to rely on a pattern much more heavily. So that's where I want to be the most helpful with my patterns, is for that confident beginner to intermediate quilter.
All right, Andi, my next question for you is, what outside of the quilting world inspires you? Or has inspired you?
Right? Do I have a life outside the quilting world? I guess I try to think, where I am, what I'm doing when I'm not quilting, because when I'm traveling, there will always be something that I take a picture of that is going to be an inspiration for a quilt someday, whether it's the colors or the carpet designs on airports tend to be a popular thing. When you see quilters travel pictures, or just the sense of a place that then will inspire future projects. So that's mainly where I get it, is from, whether it's nature or architecture or something in the outside world.
And you think of a particular pattern where you pulled that inspiration? I think I have one in mind that you might be referring, or not referring, but I think I've seen one maybe inspired as you were talking. I loved your block of the month that you did right before QuiltCon. Not maybe right before, but the year before, that we booed at QuiltCon in 2022.
So the directions.
With the arrows. Yes,
yeah,
the directions. Yeah. So it felt very much pulled from Arizona, where you are. Like the color inspiration, the arrows. That's what kind of sticks in my head from that design, are the arrows, or at least the flying geese design that you've created in there. That's where I feel like you pulled from your experience of just being in Arizona.
And the background on that, because I cannot claim it at all, is that was my mother's inspiration. And she had been perusing the internet as we do these days, and she came across a quilt that had some feathers kind of in different directions. And so she said, she sent me a picture and said, you should write a, 2 books and several patterns later, that's why it will become very obvious to our audience that it's all Andi's mom's fault. So,
thank you, Andi's mom.
Exactly.
Shout out to Andi's mom.
Yeah. So yeah, that's funny. But yes, we did, collaborate on the color palette, and it does have a very Southwest feel. So it's nice. It's nice when people can make those connections. And there have been several people that use similar Southwest colors like rusts and turquoise and things in that quilt. And it's really pretty. So,
yes.
What about you? Outside of the quilt world, where do you find inspiration?
I have to say nature as well. A lot of color. Like right now, I've been really interested in that orange and turquoise contrast, or sometimes it's like a brick red, a really dark, dirty red, and a muddy red,
Mm-hmm.
dirty red, and darker, like muddier turquoise. That contrast really just lights my eyes up right now. And I'm a very, very amateur gardener. So lately, green and gardens have been coming into mind. And that's when I've started naming and creating quilts after women in my life. So I guess women have been inspiring me, just learning more about um, the experiences of older women in particular, and the kind of things we've been up against as women in the workforce and at home and things like that. I've been learning more and more about that. And I've been naming quilts after women who've inspired me. The latest one that I had released was my sister's best friend. She passed away from COVID right after giving birth.
Mm-hmm.
It was a really tough battle. And that was one way that I celebrated her memory, was I designed a quilt and I did a fundraiser to help raise a little bit of money for her family to help cover her medical bills. And that was Yvette's garden. Her name was Yvette, and she loved mermaids. And I wanted to create something to remember her by, and sunflowers inspired me. And I created this beautiful kind of ocean feel, but sunflower with a half Dresden plate or quarter Dresden plate on a trellis. So it looked like sunflowers kind of growing upwards. And come to find out, there was a tie to sunflowers for her too. So it just ended up being a beautiful quilt inspired by my sister's best friend, who was also my friend. And then I have another one that was inspired by my cousin. Her name was Ellie. So it was Ellie's garden. And she had gotten married a few years ago. So that one's only half done because I created the pattern and we knocked it out to get it done for her wedding. So the pattern's about half done. It was enough to where my mom and my sister kind of took it and finished it. And so I designed the pattern. They created the quilt. My mom quilted it. And then we were able to gift it to her at her wedding.
So now it's time to slow down and make the actual sample.
Yes. So those are the two I have right now for that garden series. And then I have a couple more in the works. One it reminded me of Argyle sweaters, which reminded me of my mom's cousin. So her name is Sandra. So it'll be Sandra's garden.
So taking this a little bit down a direction of a little bit away from inspiration, but just the guidance for business owners and designers and folks as they venture out into that business world is to define your niche. So how has that concept, either do you find it constraining to feel that you're in a niche, or how do you overcome those boundaries with your quilts and your pattern writing?
That's a good question. I did a lot of exploring my own patterns. So one piece of advice I got that really stuck with me was to look at what you've made and to look at your favorites. So what you've made that are your favorites, and then also look around you at what are your favorite quilts that you're drawn to. And then also look at the quilts that repel you. Like, why do you like them? Why you don't? And kind of try to find your own preference first, and then discover your niche through your own preferences. That's kind of where I went with mine. I realized I like quicker quilts. I like more basic quilts with a little bit larger blocks. Some of my newer ones aren't so large, but I do like quicker projects. So my niche for patterns in particular has been more of a modern feel with larger blocks and more simple blocks. So again, I use a lot of Haskell triangles. There are a lot of triangles in my patterns, a lot of stars. And then sashing for my gardens. I like sashing as well. So That's been a self-exploratory thing. And one thing that keeps coming up though, which I made an entire quilt guild program and lecture and workshop for, is movement. So I realized that I pulled a lot of inspiration from movement, and the quilts that repelled me didn't have a lot of movement, or they had way too much, and it made my eyes dizzy. So I realized that, and it took years. Like, it took 2 or 3 years to really figure out what I liked in a quilt, which, and I had already made these quilts and realized later that that is my style, that is my niche. It didn't come right away, and it didn't come before the patterns. It came after.
Mm-hmm.
So what about you, Andi?
Yeah, I have a hard time doing just one thing. And this is not my mom's fault. So the exception that proves the rule. I blame this on my Libra personality, that I always have at least two things going on. So it would be very hard for me to narrow things down to just one technique. Maybe, there's some people that are all about applique, or, all about paper piecing. I do a little bit of paper piecing, don't do any applique, but
a little bit applique.
Yeah, I do long arming. So I'm very interested in the quilting finishing aspect of it, as well as the basic pattern. I love to work with classic quilt blocks. I like modern design. So there's all these different facets that may come out and be the prominent thing. So sometimes it does make it a little bit hard to attract, because the business theory behind the advice to narrow down your niche is that if you're trying to please everybody, you're not going to please anybody. Mm-hmm. So if you can get really clear on that one specific person, that one specific thing or style that you offer, then you're able to attract the right people. But I just figure there's enough variety in the quilting world that you can dabble a little bit and not be narrowly defined by just one technique or process. So I offer a little bit of a few things.
I noticed that you like to bounce around to lots of different things. Hence the podcast. I have one more question for you. What is your favorite type of quilt and size of quilt to design? This can be because it sells well. It could be just because you like to.
My go-to size is about 60 by 70. And I came up with that years ago because that was the requested size for Quilts of Valor. And I love doing charity projects for Quilts of Valor. If I'm doing a quilt along or something, I will tend to do it in patriotic colors with the intent to donate to Quilts of Valor, because I have way too many quilts here in my own house. My family doesn't need any more quilts. As I said, my mom quilts, so it's not like I can give them to brothers, nephews, nieces, all that kind of stuff. Everybody has enough quilts. So I like to have that charitable outlet. So yeah, the 60 by 70 size is pretty much what I stick to. It tends to become a challenge as a designer because people expect to see multiple sizes. And so you have to spend that extra time and do that extra math to get all the sizes. And so that's what I've been working on with my little bit different pattern collection in 2023, is to make sure that I offer a lap, a twin, and a queen size of my quilts. So yeah, and I just figure when I have offered just one size, you can make things bigger or smaller pretty easily by either adding or subtracting blocks and borders. And then the pattern comes in because you need the fabric yardage that the designer has graciously done the math for. So
EQ8.
yeah, right.
EQ8 does fabric for me, and then I test it out, and it's usually pretty close. Usually,
yeah. And I'm sorry, I totally focused on the size aspect of the question because I forgot the other part of the question.
Oh, no, that's fine. I guess I should have broken that up. Let's see. What's your favorite type of quilt to design? So we talked about a bunch of different ones, but what's your favorite type?
I always go for classic star blocks would probably be my my style. And I do put in a lot of negative space, actually. And so that gets, that fills the need for the long arm quilting designs that I like to play with too.
Okay. So I was thinking a little more technique-wise. So technique-wise, what do you like? Like simple piecing, or not simple, but traditional piecing? Do you like, I know we talked about foundation paper piecing. I know you said no applique.
Yeah, I stay away from applique. You will rarely see a quilt from me that is applique. But yeah, I like traditional piecing. And so that's, my love of classic quilt blocks that I try to put a modern spin on will typically be just regular, traditional, straight piecing for those. I have a limited number of paper piecing patterns because sometimes the design just calls for it. So
yeah, sometimes you just can't do it without it.
Yeah. What about you? Do you have a specific style of quilt?
I like traditional piecing, the same as you. However, I am finding a love for raw edge applique. That was the last project I was working on before creative burnout really hit me hard. And that's the thing that's calling my name recently. That wants me to try again. It sounds kind of weird, like it's talking, but like it's like in the back of my brain going, that was fun. Let's try that again. That kind of thing. So raw edge applique has been really fun. I had no patterns with raw edge applique except for a little sunflower block I did. I think I was the only one with raw edge applique. Yeah. But I've been doing a little art project type things on the side, and that's what's been kind of inspiring that new love for applique, which I did not like before. I do not do any hand sewing, that's for sure. So any applique you see from me will be by machine, and most likely it will be raw edge.
Cool.
I do like that.
And what size?
Yeah, size. I like overly large lap quilts. So like a throw. And I honestly got to the point where I'm tired of doing different sizes for my patterns, and I make the size that I want. And I stick with that. I'm exhausted constantly. So when the inspiration hits me, I stick with the size I really like, and I can always add later is what I figure. So if I want to relaunch the pattern, it'd be a great time to add a new size and a new sample and relaunch it later on.
Yeah, that's a great realization that you only have so much time and energy, and
feel bad about it. I'm just going to embrace it. This is part of my design journey and what I choose to do. It's not for everybody, but that's what I choose to do.
Yep. And done is better than perfect in so many different areas. So
yeah,
let's get those patterns developed and out in the world. So that is terrific. Who's inspiring you right now?
I gotta say, my 5-year-old. And that sounds kind of silly, but he has made huge strides this past couple weeks in working on his communication. It's been a huge goal for him to use his words and talk through his big feelings and, all those 5-year-old things. He just turned 5. He's just a 5-year-old. He's going to go to kindergarten here very soon. So he hasn't even done that yet. So we've been working with him and he has come such a long way in such a short time. And it really just, he inspires me because it's like, if he can do it, I can do it, you know? If he can take the time and find that motivation and keep working on it to get better and better in such a short amount of time, just a couple weeks, then I can too. I can improve my own self-talk and maybe get my creativity back, you know?
Yeah.
Get out of this burnout.
We definitely want that. I am going to say the person that is inspiring me right now is a coworker, because we have said all along that we have day jobs. And so we do talk to people about totally separate topics than quilting all day long. And my coworker, Gia, is really good at asking thoughtful questions. And I tend to just blurt out the first thing that comes to mind, and I don't do a lot of reflection on things. And so I'm trying to slow down a little bit and consider the whole situation before I jump in and really analyze where you need more information, which is very important in our work as instructional designers for that day job. To be able to do that needs analysis and look at, okay, what is the real problem here, and what can we do to fix it? It may not be, designing more training, which tends to be the popular answer for the instructional design team, but that is, my coworker is inspiring me.
Aw, I love hearing this. This is one of my favorite things we do.
So stay tuned for more inspiration from Quilting on the Side.
Hashtag Andy's mom's fault.
And if you enjoyed this episode of Quilting on the Side, please leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
And hit the subscribe button so you don't miss our next chat. Until then, remember to have fun in your business and do a little quilting on the side.